Before we start, if this quiet storytelling helps you feel less alone tonight, leave a comment with your time and where you're listening from. And if it brings you comfort, please subscribe so this little corner of calm stays alive. Now, close your eyes. Let the past unfold. Asterisk in the heat of ancient Mesopotamia, where the Euphrates wound like a slow breath through dust and time. The city of Babylon stood tall, walled and watched, filled with order and law. Here, in the heart of a civilization praised for its code, the code of Hammurabi, women were gathered in open markets, not to sell wares, not to buy livestock, but to be livestock. In a sense, displayed on wooden blocks and priced like barley. This was not seen as scandalous. It was customary, expected, even celebrated, at least by the men Herodotus. The Greek historian wrote about it with a strange casualness. Once a year, in every village under Babylonian rule, all eligible young women were gathered together in the town square. They stood before men of all ranks and wealth, silent and still. The most beautiful were auctioned first, not to the highest bidder for love, but as a transaction, a legal and economic arrangement. Beauty, in this moment, became taxable, tradable. The women had no say. But the money raised from the sale of the most attractive was not simply pocketed by the state. It was redistributed to ensure that even the plain or less desirable women could be married off by offering their husbands a financial incentive. If you couldn't afford a beautiful wife, the state would pay you to take a less sought-after one. This was, in their eyes, equality. But imagine the silence behind the curtain, the whispered prayers of the girls as they waited to be judged. Their families may have dressed them in their finest tunics, oiled their hair, rubbed their skin with ochre or frankincense. But when they stood up on that platform, it wasn't their words that mattered. It was the symmetry of their jaw, the curve of their hips, whether their skin bore pox scars or mole, whether their posture looked obedient. This was a ritual of numbers and bones. Babylon was a society built on law and record-keeping. From grain counts to slave rosters, everything was tallied, including women. A man did not just marry a bride. He acquired her like a plot of land or a herd of goats. Her value depended on her purity, but also her beauty, her youth, and her supposed temperament. Traits defined by others. There is no surviving record of how the girls felt. No diary, pages, no tear-stained letters. Only silence. And the silence is deafening. The idea of auctioning brides is not unique to Babylon. But here it was institutionalized, standardized, and, in a strange way, sanitized. It was not backroom dealing. It was not shadowed coercion. It was done in daylight, in the town square, with priests, scribes, and elders present. Some historians argue that this system gave poorer women a better chance at marriage. Others argue that it reduced all women to objects, regardless of the financial redistribution. Both might be true, because a transaction can be fair and still be cruel. Behind the marketplace were tents, small spaces where mothers waited, nervously, and daughters rehearsed polite smiles. A girl might clutch a charm around her neck, perhaps a small clay amulet to the goddess Ishtar. But even Ishtar, goddess of love and war, could not always help. The bidders would ask questions, not to the girls, but to the auctioneer. Can she sew? Is she barren? Does she anger easily? The girl would be turned slightly to the left, then the right. Her teeth might be examined, her hands checked for calluses, her shoulders measured. But no one would ask her. Name. The silence of ancient brides echoes across centuries, not through words, but through patterns. The same assessments, the same phrases, the same bargain struck between beauty and power. One can only wonder what it felt like for a girl whose price kept climbing, celebrated for her beauty, but also silently realizing that the more she was worth, the less she would control. And what of the girls whose value failed to impress, who watched themselves be sold for coppers, while other girls brought in silver and gold? Were they grateful just to be chosen, or did they carry that price tag in their minds forever? Herodotus tells us that this practice eventually faded. Societies changed, empires fell. But the idea that a woman's body must be assessed before it is honored, that has taken much longer to die. So, as you rest now, consider this. How many women, across how many centuries, have stood quietly while others named their worth aloud? Asterisk, let's return to that square dot. It's mid-morning. The sun over Babylon is pale but rising, casting slow-moving shadows between columns and market tents. The air smells of cooked dates, animal dung, and burning myrrh. A hush has fallen, not of reverence, but of focus, of attention, the kind of stillness that comes before a transaction. The platform is swept clean each morning, not for hygiene, for presentation. Women are lined up behind woven screens, their names, if they were ever recorded, now lost. The scribes who noted down each sale didn't include those names. They wrote the buyer, the sum, perhaps the father's name, perhaps a feature, slender, wide-eyed, dark-skinned, rarely more than that. The law allowed this, encouraged it even. Babylonian society, structured by the Hammurabi Code, was one of rules and consequences. While Hammurabi's famous stele is often cited for its eye for an eye judgment, it also laid out expectations for marriage, dowries, contracts, responsibilities of wives, even punishments for infidelity. But before any of that came into play, the transaction had to be made. That's where the auction fit in. There's little archaeological record of these events. No recovered receipts from a bridal sale. No etched tablets saying, "Today I was bought by a man I've never met." Instead, we rely on second-hand writings like Herodotus, a foreigner describing what he saw, or what he claimed to have seen. Some scholars even debate the accuracy of his words, but others point to patterns across cultures, because this wasn't unique to Babylon. Bride sale traditions existed in Assyria, in Persia, in early Greece. Even echoes of it continued centuries later. In parts of medieval Europe under different names, bride price maiden market, or arranged dowry. The framing changed, but the core remained. A woman's marriageability could be publicly assessed and economically transferred. Back in Babylon, though, these events weren't hidden. They were public, organized, and, at least on paper, they claimed fairness. The beautiful women were sold first. Their money was pooled into a bridal fund. Then, one by one, women considered less attractive. A phrase found in ancient texts, not softened here, were called up. The auctioneer would announce the amount available for her. A man might be offered 10 shekels to marry her, or more, or less. But the money didn't go to her. It went to the man. The system ensured that no woman remained unmarried. But think, bow, of what that meant. Marriage not as choice, but obligation. A girl who didn't want to marry still had to stand on that block. If she was disabled, scarred, or simply different, the crowd might murmur. Yet someone would take her, not for love, but for compensation. Her silence wasn't a sign of agreement. It was ritual. There are accounts whispered from clay to ink over the centuries of girls who cried during these auctions, of those who laughed nervously, mistaking the ceremony for pageantry, and of those who simply stared, unmoving, until they were claimed. Once chosen, a girl was escorted to her husband's family, often that very day. No time for reflection, no celebration, no song. Some families may have felt proud. My daughter fetched a high price, they'd boast. But others might have felt shame, not for the auction, but for what it revealed. That their daughter did not meet the silent standards of womanhood. And what were those standards? Skin that was pale but not sickly, hips that promised fertility, eyes that looked downward, a voice not too loud, a family with no rumors, wombs without question, all imagined traits, all unverifiable until after the marriage, when the inspection continued. In Babylon, once married, a woman moved in with her husband's family. She was now under his authority. If she displeased him by failing to produce children, or speaking out of turn, or even being accused of adultery, he could send her back, or worse. The Code of Hammurabi allows for a husband to throw his wife in the river if she is found unfaithful. If innocent, the gods would protect her. If not, she would drown. Justice, measured by water. But before such laws came into play, there was the auction, a ritual masked as opportunity. What did the girls talk about behind the curtain before stepping out? Did older sisters comfort younger ones? Did mothers whisper advice passed down for generations? How to stand, when to smile, what not to say? Did anyone rebel? Perhaps a girl once refused to walk out. Perhaps she ran. But in a society where daughters were legal dependents, such rebellion was not freedom, it was shame. Her father could be punished, her siblings ostracized, so most stayed quiet. Most walked the wooden steps, stood tall, and waited for the gavel to fall. It's easy to judge these scenes with modern eyes, but what happens when you strip away time and setting? A girl's body being priced, her traits debated by strangers, her future decided without her voice. These aren't relics, they're patterns. So as you lie back now and feel the warmth of the blanket around you, the darkness just behind your eyelids, ask yourself, what systems today still dress up control as tradition, and whose silence makes them possible? The oxen is over. The sun has slipped into a late afternoon haze, casting long shadows from the market tents across the stone streets of Babylon. The dust that once clung to bare feet has settled. Traders have packed their linens. Scribes have closed their tablets, and the brides, or what they are now, have been led away. Some weep quietly behind veils. By those keep their faces stilled, stoic, trained by mothers who told them, you must not show too much. Whether that meant joy or dread didn't matter. Expression itself was dangerous. The men, meanwhile, haggle over other goods. They sip watered wine, they joke. Some boast. I paid 2 shekels less than my cousin last year, one says, and she's finer in the ankle. The words sting, but they are not meant to. They're simply part of the system, a structure older than any of them. And structures, even when brutal, are hard to see from the inside. What happened to these brides afterward rarely made it into records. That's the silent cruelty of ancient systems. The lives of women were lived, shaped, and ended with little trace left behind. We know some were fertile, and this brought them temporary protection. Others were barren and cast out, perhaps quietly, returned to the market or sent into servitude. Some may have found kindness in their new homes. Others lived lives of quiet endurance. But what matters more than what we don't know is what we can see, the patterns that continued. Because the Babylonian bridal auction is not an isolated oddity. It is part of a long human rhythm, a recurring ceremony where a woman's value is spoken aloud, but her voice is not dot. In early Assyria, brides were also assessed before marriage, though with more emphasis on property transfer. In parts of ancient India, the Swayamvara ceremony allowed a woman to choose her husband, but only from a group preselected by her family. In Sparta, women were taken as brides by mock abduction, staged yet enforced. In Rome, fathers gave their daughters away by formal manus transfers, treating the bride like movable property. And across all these examples, from Persia to Egypt to China, we find one constant inspection, not always physical, sometimes symbolic, but always binding. In Babylon, the inspection came with a price tag. In other places, it came through ritual bathing, hymen examination, or even moral questioning by village elders. One by one, each bride's worth was read like a document, and like a document, she was filed, signed, and delivered dot. And yet, despite this, or perhaps because of it, some women resisted in small ways. We don't have their names, but we glimpse them. There are clay tablets with scratched-out lines. Scribes who noted bride refused beside a name, though what followed is lost. There are myths of goddesses who cursed their forced husbands, folk songs of girls who ran into rivers to escape their fate. These aren't the voices of revolution. They're whispers, but they are there. Over time, the Babylonian auction disappeared. Empires collapsed. New rulers brought new traditions. The silence continued, but it took new forms. Dowry systems replaced public sales. Contracts replaced auctions. But the underlying idea stayed, that a woman's body could be assessed, and her future traded. And we must ask, how different is that from the silent appraisals women still face today? Swipe right or swipe left. A profile picture judged in milliseconds. A girl's appearance used to calculate her value in careers, in marriage, even in danger. The methods have changed, but the core remains. The auction has simply moved. When we study boring history, we often assume it's harmless, dry, benign. But boring things are often the most dangerous because they are unchallenged, normalized, quiet. And in that quiet, control grows. So, as we close this story, with the sky over Babylon turning pale violet, and the heat of the day fading into the stones, let us remember the girls who stood silently on that wooden platform. Some smiled, some trembled, some were never chosen at all. They are not just footnotes. They are our grandmothers, our ancestors, our forgotten mirrors. The market is gone now, but the echoes never left. How many decisions today still rest on a value no one ever consented to be judged by? Close your eyes. The ground is hard beneath you. Packed earth over stone, warm from the sun. Around you, there's the quiet hum of a city that has no need for walls. A Spartan city. No market cries. No merchants haggling. Just discipline, order, breath and bone. You're standing on the edge of a public gymnasium, not a place of leisure, but of preparation. And before you is something both strange and ordinary to this society. A line of girls, stripped bare, walking silently before their elders. In ancient Sparta, the female body was not hidden. It was inspected, not out of prurience, but policy. From the age of 7, Spartan girls were trained nearly as rigorously as boys. They ran, wrestled, threw javelins, not for sport, but for state. A strong woman, it was believed, would birth strong warriors. And Sparta needed warriors more than anything. Its entire society revolved around war, and the machinery of war began in the womb. That belief shaped everything, even courtship. Unlike in Athens, where women were largely confined to the home and excluded from public life, Spartan girls were visible. They sang in choruses, performed in festivals, and during certain ceremonies they walked, not cloaked, but bare, their bodies on display, sometimes with hair cropped short like boys, sometimes smeared with olive oil to show muscle tone. These were not erotic displays in the modern sense. They were civic rituals, a test. The Spartan elders watched. Mothers whispered from the sidelines. Fathers stood quietly, taking mental note. And the boys were told to look, not with lust, but with judgment, to decide Over time, who among these girls would be a worthy partner, a future mother to soldiers? This wasn't a private affair. It was public selection, masked as cultural pride. The girls, for their part, were trained not to flinch, to run with poise, to move without shame, to laugh without hesitation. A Spartan woman was to be unafraid of pain, of exposure, of male eyes. But still, that exposure wasn't hers to choose. She walked not for herself. She walked because the system demanded it. During the Gymnopedia, an annual Spartan festival, both boys and girls danced naked before the community. The term literally means festival of the unarmed. It was meant to celebrate youth, strength, and obedience. But beneath the music and song, there was another layer, silent evaluation. A girl whose shoulders sagged, whose knees knocked, whose movements were not fluid. She would be remembered, her name spoken later in whispered corners of households. Not strong enough, too thin, too slow. A girl who stumbled might find herself without suitors. A girl who excelled might catch the eye of a rising warrior's family. And yet, despite the physicality of it all, Spartan girls had more autonomy than most women in the ancient world. They could inherit land. They could own wealth. They weren't married off at puberty, but later, around 18 or even older. This gave them a brief window of personal growth, of voice. But that voice still existed within limits. And those limits began with the walk. What would it feel like, barefoot in front of your entire community? The sun on your back, your arms swinging in rhythm with a song you've known since childhood. You've been trained for this. Your mother taught you to stand tall, to breathe evenly, to never cry in public. You're not performing femininity, you're performing strength. Yet still strength measured by others, others who will decide. Your future based on the arch of your back and the tone of your legs. And when the walk is done, you return to your place among the girls. You wait. Perhaps you catch the eye of someone across the field. A boy you've seen before, sword strapped to his waist. He nods. That's all. That's the beginning. Marriage in Sparta was not romantic. It was strategic. A man could not marry until he was 30, until he had proved himself in battle. But courtship began much earlier, in glances, in silent admiration of strength. It was said that Spartan marriages were arranged in secret, even consummated. In secret, husbands would sneak away from barracks to lie with their wives in silence. Returning before dawn, there was honor in this secrecy. It was meant to build desire, to strengthen bonds. But it also meant that the girl had little say. She was chosen, admired for her strength, yes, but still chosen. And all of that began with the walk. The Spartan bride was not veiled. She was shaved, dressed in a man's cloak, her hair cut short like a boy. The idea was symbolic. The groom captured her like a soldier claiming a prize. Even in marriage, she played a role. Woman as vessel, but also woman as reflection of the male world. So as you lie back now, in the quiet of your room, the hum of your fan, like the wind off the Eurotas River, ask yourself, if strength was the standard, Why was it still men who got to define it? Let's return to the dusty gymnasium, where olive trees cast long, swaying shadows across the training ground. The girls are dismissed now, their daily exercises complete. A quiet cheer goes up in the distance, not from them, but from a group. Bung behind the fence, whispering bisses about who would be chosen for what family, what lineage. This was Sparta's unspoken theater. Not just a society built for war, but for breeding warriors. Every policy, every ceremony, every family's ambition was tuned toward one outcome: survival through strength. But strength alone wasn't enough. It had to be seen, proved, displayed. And so a young Spartan girl's strength was constantly under surveillance. Not just in how far she could throw a discus, but in how she laughed, how she ran, how she responded when she fell in the dirt. Grace under scrutiny, endurance under a smile. Girls were taught to be bold, not demure. They sang mocking songs by boys who lagged in combat. They were expected to speak their minds. And yet, when it came time for marriage, the rituals of selection were still shaped by quiet control. The gymnopedia, the dancing, the naked running, all of it doubled as matchmaking. The girl's body became a resume. Her form put a letter of intent. It's worth remembering that the Greeks, even those outside Sparta, were obsessed with the ideal body. In Athens, they sculpted gods with impossible abs. In art, the male form was sacred. But in Sparta, the female form was honored differently. It was praised not for beauty, but for utility, for potential. A narrow waist might mean easier childbirth, broad shoulders, sturdier sons, thick thighs, strength passed on through blood. There were no love poems for Spartan girls, no painted vases of courtship under fig trees. Only duty, only pride wrapped in stoicism. Even the marriage ceremony, when it came, was a bizarre performance. Once a match was arranged, the bride would be taken from her family, her hair shaved close to the scalp, and dressed in a man's cloak. Sometimes the act was staged as a mock abduction, reenacting the mythology of early marriage rituals. The husband would sneak into her quarters at night. They'd lie together, and before dawn, he'd return to his barracks. No public dinners, no temple blessings, just ritual, quiet, strange, and painfully impersonal. Some scholars say this arrangement was meant to make Spartan men value their wives more, seeing them in secret, desiring them from afar, amid the harshness of military life. Others believe it was meant to keep marriage from interfering with a soldier's loyalty to the state. Love was a distraction. Lust could be managed, but duty could not waver. And the women, they bore children alone. They managed estates. They owned land when their husbands were away at war, which was often, in fact, by some accounts, Spartan women controlled nearly 2/5 of the land in Laconia. Unthinkable in Athens, unimaginable in Rome. But that power was conditional. It was not feminist freedom. It was structured independence, a kind of control given only because it served the broader military machine. If a woman failed to bear children, particularly sons, her value dimmed. She might be cast aside, or pitied, or pressured into trying again, perhaps with another man. In fact, Spartan society sometimes encouraged older men who hadn't produced heirs to allow younger, more virile men to sleep with their wives, not as betrayal, but as state-sanctioned breeding. Imagine what that means. A woman could be passed between husbands for the sake of eugenics, her body discussed in whispers like a prize mare, not because she was weak, but because she was expected to be strong, strong enough to comply, to submit, to produce. Strength was not just celebrated in Sparta, it was weaponized. And yet, amid this structure, there were moments, brief, quiet ones, where a girl might have felt proud, where she might have stood on the parade ground, chest high, muscles lean, knowing she could outrun most boys her age, where a chorus of women's voices rang out under moonlight, mocking cowards, praising heroes, daring the world to silence them. Perhaps in those moments they felt free, briefly, but the question remains, free for what? To marry, to bear, to manage estates in absence of men? Or was the freedom only ever an illusion, strength allowed only when it served the system? As you lie back again, breathing slowly, listening to the soft murmur of your room, the echoes of sandals on dust, the thrum of distant drums, ask yourself, can a woman be truly free if every inch of her strength is still weighed against someone else's purpose? Night falls on Sparta. The torches along the training grounds flicker out. The songs of the gymnopedia fade into the hills. The girls, the ones who paraded, who ran, who danced and laughed as they were watched, retreat to their homes. Some still carry olive oil on their skin, a slick sheen that glows under moonlight. Others, barefoot and quiet, retreat without words. The day is done, but the judgments are not. In the households of elders and warriors, whispers have begun. Did you see her gait? She moves like a deer, too thin, too proud. Her mother bore 4 sons. She may be worth the risk. These aren't compliments or insults. They are calculations. And the girl's future hangs in the space between them. Sparta has long been romanticized. Historians, especially those outside of Greece, have often praised it as a proto-feminist state. A place where women were educated, where they trained, owned land, and spoke their minds. But what's often left out of that narrative is the motive. Spartan women weren't empowered for themselves. They were sculpted, taught, and permitted. Visibility because the state needed them to be strong and obedient, at once commanding and compliant. Even their sharp tongues, something Athenians mocked, served a purpose. Spartan women were expected to shame their sons into bravery. Come back with your shield, or on it, they were said to command, not just as mothers, but as instruments of morale. A woman who mourned a coward was a threat to the fabric of Sparta itself. So, despite the dances and marches, despite their confidence and land rights, Spartan girls still lived beneath a quiet pressure to meet an ideal crafted by men. Think again of the wedding ritual. After the selection, after the silent nod from a suitor's family, a girl would be taken in what resembled a kidnapping. Her head was shaved, her body clothed in a man's tunic. It was believed this symbolized the transition from girlhood to marriage, but to modern ears, it sounds like erasure. She was no longer herself. She became what the groom was trained to want, a symbol, a myth, a mirror of himself. This wasn't meant to be cruel. It was tradition. It was pride. And yet, the pride masked a deep vulnerability. Because in Sparta, a woman's worth was still linked to her womb. No matter how fast she could run, no matter how sharply she could argue, her ability to produce healthy sons was the anchor of her identity. The state permitted strength, but not rebellion. It honored autonomy, so long as it produced warriors. Some women conformed, others quietly resisted. There are stories rarely told of Spartan girls who refused matches, who delayed marriage, who never bore children and instead lived with sisters or widowed mothers. They were outliers, not celebrated, but they existed, and still there is something haunting about the naked walks. Not because of the nudity, but because of the silence, the normalization, the idea that being watched, being appraised, being measured was just another step in girlhood, like learning to braid one's hair, like learning to hold a javelin. The girls may have laughed with each other, played pranks behind temple walls, braided olive leaves into crowns, but every step they took in public was a step toward selection, not of their choosing, not on their terms. Even their training had limits. While they could run and shout and lift weights, they were never taught to lead the army, never invited to counsel. Their muscles were for motherhood, their discipline for domestic command, and yet their presence lingers. When the rest of Greece wrote women into the background, silent wives, obedient daughters, Sparta allowed them to step forward, prepared to speak, to move, to shine. It may not have been freedom, but it left behind a shape, a crack in the narrative, and cracks, even narrow ones, let in light. So, as the night deepens around you now, as your body softens under the weight of rest, think of the Spartan girls who walked with pride across dusty parade grounds, knowing they were being watched, but walking anyway. They weren't free, not truly, but they were seen. And in a world where most women were erased, sometimes being seen was a rebellion all its own. What would history look like if all the girls who were only ever measured had also been heard? The sun is low over Rome, gilding the tiled roofs with light that turns quickly to shadow. In a modest domus, a Roman household, not quite wealthy, not quite poor, a family prepares for what they call confirmation. Not a celebration, not a feast, but a ritual inspection. Tonight, their daughter will be married, but tomorrow she must be proven. There is no ceremony for this part, no priest, no music, no blessing. Only a sheet, white linen, laid carefully across the marriage bed. Beneath it, expectation. Above it, silence. The Roman world, much like many ancient civilizations, bound a woman's worth to her chastity. not just socially, but legally, economically, politically. A girl's virginity was not hers. It was her father's honor, her family's reputation, her dowry's leverage, her future husband's property. And in many Roman households, that claim had to be verified, not metaphorically, physically. In wealthier homes, matrons or midwives might be called in, older women who would examine the bride before the wedding night or after. In poorer homes, no such formalities were needed. The sheet would speak for itself. If it bore blood by morning, her honor was intact. If not, accusations could begin. This was known, expected, taught. Girls were warned from childhood. Do not run too hard. You'll lose your maidenhead. Do not ride astride. You'll be ruined. Do not speak to men too boldly, or they'll assume the worst. Their bodies became symbols of trust, not for themselves, but for everyone around them. The idea of virginity was not biological. It was behavioral, cultural. A girl was assumed to be untouched unless proven otherwise, and proof meant bleeding. But we now know how unreliable that standard was. Not all women bleed. Not all hymens rupture. Not all signs are visible. And still, in ancient Rome, the linen sheet was law. After the wedding, the bride's mother-in-law, or, in some homes, a household servant would retrieve the bedsheet. Sometimes before dawn, it would be examined, whispered over. In extreme cases, displayed to guests, to neighbors, to those who doubted the girl's virtue. A stained sheet could be paraded like a family crest, a clean sheet that could mean disgrace, lawsuits, annulment, or worse, humiliation in the forum, the public square. Roman law allowed a husband to return a bride if she was discovered to be non-virgo at marriage. He could sue for fraud, demand her dowry be returned, disown any children later born. And yet, none of this involved her voice. The bride herself was often silent. Her testimony meant little. She could swear on her family's honor, cry before her mother, even pray aloud in the temple of Vesta. But if the signs were missing, if the cloth was dry, her body was judged a liar. This obsession didn't come from nowhere. Rome was a society that prized control, discipline, structure, and what better place to assert control than the body of a woman? The goddess Vesta, patron of hearth and home, was served by priestesses who were required to remain virgins for 30 years. If one was found to have broken that vow, she was buried alive. The symbolism was clear. A woman's worth began with silence and restraint. In elite Roman families, daughters were often engaged by the age of 12, married by 14. The match was political, strategic, and their bodies, untouched, were part of the contract. In some cases, especially among patricians, doctors were summoned to inspect a girl's body before marriage. These physicians, all male, would examine her genitals to assess enactness. The practice was considered scientific, clinical, necessary, a form of contract enforcement. The bride's experience, irrelevant. What did it feel like to stand before an elder woman or a physician while they lifted your tunic and inspected the folds of your body. What did it mean to be told that your future depended not on your words, but on something you could not see, something someone else had to verify? And what about the girls who had never known a man, but whose bodies offered no blood on the night? Some were quietly accepted, others were beaten or sent back to their fathers in disgrace. A few were forced to swear oaths before household gods. A rare few fled in the lower classes. This inspection took less formal forms. A woman who birthed a child too early after marriage could be accused of deception. If she was assaulted before marriage and dared to speak it aloud, she risked the same shame. The law did not distinguish. A body either proved purity or it didn't. There were no exceptions. But perhaps most telling of all was what happened when a bride did pass the inspection, when the sheet bore blood, and the household exhaled with relief. The girl might be congratulated, gifted a necklace, given sweet cakes, not for her happiness, but for her compliance. Her pain became proof, her silence celebration. So tonight, as you rest your head and the room softens around you, ask yourself, how many women, even now, are still taught to prove their worth through pain, and whose truth is never believed unless it leaves a stain? Asterisk, the room is still. The hearth burns low, and behind a curtain drawn not for privacy, but for tradition, a Roman bride lies motionless, her hands folded beneath her neck, the weight of linen pressing down more than the weight of the man beside her. The marriage has been consummated. At least, that's what the family hopes. But now comes the part no one speaks of aloud. Yet everyone expects. What will the bedsheet reveal? This moment, strangely absent from most Roman literature, is instead found in the edges, the legal texts, the letters, the domestic manuals, and the quiet lines of Roman poetry. Not the love poems of Ovid, but the colder instructions of men like Cato the Elder or Pliny the Younger, who believed that Roman virtue began in the home, and that a woman's body was where that virtue must be planted in elite families. There might be a nutrix, a trusted nursemaid, or an elderly female relative assigned to monitor the marriage night. She might wait outside the room, listening for signs. Or worse, she might enter after inspecting the girl's thighs, the sheet, the mattress, the scent of the room. Her word, not the bride's, would be the evidence. In lower households, there was often no intermediary. The groom himself was the inspector. He would rise in the cold morning light and call his mother. Together they would present the sheet dot sometimes. The cloth would be folded and sealed, a sign of honor. In other families, it was hung for all to see, over the doorframe, in the garden, even in the atrium. A symbol that the girl had fulfilled her role, that the honor of the household had passed from father to husband, untarnished. But what about when the sheet was clean? That's where the shame began, quiet at first, then spreading like ink through parchment. A mother-in-law might whisper, "She's too familiar with her body." A neighbor might speculate, "I saw her speaking to the baker's boy last spring." A slave might mention, unprompted, that the girl once stayed late after temple. It did not matter whether the accusations were true. In Rome, as in so many patriarchal societies, a woman's innocence was not determined by experience. It was determined by perception, and perception was built by others. There were occasionally defenses available. A father could swear an oath to his daughter's chastity. The bride could be sent to a midwife for re-examination, or a family might claim divine interference, that Mars or Apollo had preserved the bride's virginity in ways mortal eyes could not see. But most often the family chose silence. They paid the dowry back. They took the girl home, and she remained there, unmarried, tainted, her name no longer spoken at family meals. In rare cases, the matter would go to court. Roman law had specific statutes regarding dowry fraud. A man could sue if he believed he had been deceived. The trial would not focus on her feelings or even her behavior, but her body. Expert witnesses, physicians, older women, even former lovers, if discovered, might be summoned to testify. A woman's body became evidence, and yet so much of this rested on myths. The myth that bleeding equals virginity. The myth that physical signs are moral truths. The myth that a woman's worth can be confirmed in a single night. Roman medical texts even contradict this obsession. Writers like Soranus of Ephesus, a physician in the early 2nd century CE, argued that the hymen bi is not a reliable marker, and that sexual experience could not be proven through inspection. But these voices were few, and their reason drowned out by law, custom, and fear in Rome was powerful. A girl might spend years fearing this one night, not for the act itself, but for what came after. She might practice how to lie still, how to avoid flinching, how to breathe quietly. She might have been told to pray to Juno, the goddess of marriage, or to Venus, the goddess of love. But she knew deep down that no goddess could bleed for her. Some brides prepared themselves physically. There are whispers unverifiable, but persistent, of mothers who pricked their daughters' thighs before marriage night, just in case. A drop of blood, smeared with care, to guard against dishonor. Others were less subtle. There are accounts of herbs inserted to cause irritation, or of girls trained to cry out convincingly, to mimic pain, to rehearse surprise, not for deception, but for survival, and for those who could not pass the test. Their lives shrank. Their rooms became smaller, their voices quieter. A girl sent back to her father's house was not just unmarried. She was suspect. Future suitors avoided her. Her sisters bore the shadow of her shame. Even her mother might stop defending her after a time. Her body did not comply. Therefore, she had failed. So, as you breathe now, slowly and deeply, and the sounds of the modern world grow distant, ask yourself, how many lives were shaped or shattered by a piece of linen, by a silence, by a lie wrapped in the word tradition. Asterisk, the house is quiet now. The sheet, stained or unstained, has been taken, folded, judged, spoken over, or not spoken of at all. And somewhere in that silence, a Roman bride wakes. She turns her face toward the wall. She does not ask what was said. She knows already whether she has been declared honorable or something else. What began as a personal night has become a public measurement, and what was private pain has been recast as legal evidence, because in Rome, nothing stayed behind closed doors for long. Even the most intimate moments between husband and wife were subject to law. The Lex Julia D. Adulteris Coascendus, a statute introduced under Emperor Augustus, criminalized adultery. But its reach went beyond that, defined purity, controlled female behavior, and turned sexual honor into something enforceable by the state. Under this law, a father could kill his daughter if he found her committing adultery in his house. A husband could kill her lover, but not her. However, if the husband failed to act, he could be charged for tolerating dishonor. And the woman, she could be exiled, her property confiscated, her name disgraced in the Acta Publica, the daily records read across Rome. It didn't matter if the accusation was true, only that her body had ceased to function as her family expected it to. In the rare event that a woman was raped, the burden of proof fell on her. She had to show evidence of resistance, of bruises, of torn clothing. And even then, if she was unmarried, her value as a future bride was considered compromised, not by the crime itself, but by what it implied about her purity. The stain on the sheet haunted her, whether it was placed there by violence or not. For the women of Rome, especially those born into patrician families, everything depended on reputation. A single accusation could end a marriage, lose a dowry, isolate a family. And so, many mothers took precautions. They sewed chastity belts, hired older servants to watch their daughters. Poor taught their girls to smile carefully, to speak little, and never to be seen alone. But these precautions did not offer real protection, only the illusion of it. Even in literature, we find traces of this shame. In Plautus' plays, virginity. This is a bargaining chip. In Roman satire, the fear of a spoiled bride is a punchline. Even in love poetry, women are praised only if they seem untouched, unbroken, fresh, innocent. Words that reduce human life to a metaphor of fruit. The body always as a vessel, never as a voice. Yet voices did exist. We catch glimpses of them in letters, in gossip, in rare moments when women spoke out. A preserved letter from a Roman matron to her daughter warns, "Let no man define your honor by cloth and bleeding. Let your conduct be your truth." A brave sentiment, but rare, risky. And for the enslaved women of Rome, there was no such hope. They were never inspected for virginity, because they were never expected to be pure. Their bodies were owned, used, their worth measured by fertility, not modesty. If they bore children, the offspring became property. If they resisted, they were punished. Their pain was not shameful, it was invisible. So while freeborn women were scrutinized for purity, enslaved women were denied the right to care who touched them at all, to silences, one from expectation, one from erasure, and the worst part, many women, free and enslaved, came to believe in the system. They became its keepers, mothers who inspected, sisters who whispered, midwives who reported, because power, even in slivers, is hard to surrender. And tradition, once internalized, becomes its own form of prison. So what happened to the girls who failed the test? Some were married off quietly to lower status men, others sent to rural relatives. Some became priestesses, not by choice, but to preserve family honor. A few, cast out completely, disappeared into Rome's lower alleys, their names lost to dust, but most simply faded from conversation, from marriage prospects, from family portraits. They were not mourned, they were forgotten, and the law remained. For centuries, even as the empire changed, as emperors came and went, as Christianity arrived, as temples fell into ruin, the obsession with purity remained. It shifted forms, but it never disappeared. The bedsheet was no longer hung on the door, but it was still remembered. It became a metaphor, a fear passed down, a whisper between mothers and daughters. And in many parts of the world, it still lingers today. So, as the last embers of the fire burn down in your mind's eye, and your breath slows into the rhythm of rest, ask yourself, what would change if a girl's worth was measured not by what her body hides, but by what her voice reveals? Asterisk, the first sounds are not drums, nor bells, nor footsteps. They are whispers of women hunched over lacquered boxes, arranging silk robes and carved combs with care, inspecting porcelain bowls and sachets of dried orange peel. Outside, red paper flutters gently in the breeze. Inside, everything is being prepared for the inspection. In Ming Dynasty China, a bride was not chosen by charm, nor always by lineage. She was evaluated thoroughly, physically, economically, behaviorally, and sometimes silently. It began with the shankin, the matchmaker's visit. A family would hire a middlewoman, often someone who knew both households. She would come bearing polite greetings, gifts of fruit, and subtle questions. How old is the girl? What zodiac sign? Can she embroider? Can she serve tea with grace? But those questions were only the beginning. Once a match was agreed upon in principle, the true inspection began. The girl, often in her early teens, would be observed under a dozen different lights. Her teeth would be checked for evenness, her fingers for dexterity, her feet wrapped since the age of 5, unwrapped and studied in private. How small, how arched, could they fit into the golden lotus shoes? Just 3 inches. Long foot binding had become a beauty standard, but it was more than that. It was a marriage currency. Toes broken and folded beneath the sole, heels forced forward with bandages, a lifelong limp interpreted as elegance. If a girl's feet weren't bound, or if they were bound poorly, her marriage prospects dropped. She might be called clumsy, unrefined, unsuitable. Yet even perfect feet did not guarantee approval. The girl's skin would be examined, 4 spots, 4 scars, 4 hints of disease. Her hairline and eyebrows were studied, her breath scented or stale, noted in passing, and, most crucially, her temper. Could she hold her tongue when spoken too harshly? Could she pour tea without spilling a drop, even when nervous? Did she show shyness? Was it the right amount? In some families, the girl was asked to perform small household tasks in front of the future in-laws. Folding cloth, mending a hem, preparing tea without wrinkling her brow. It was a stage play, and she was both performer and auditioned. No emotion, however sincere, could be shown too plainly. To smile too much was vanity. To speak too directly, arrogance. To cry, weakness. The perfect bride was a cloud, soft, floating, unobtrusive, present but barely there, and all the while her worth was being negotiated. The matchmaker would carry messages between the two families. She has good bone structure. The girl can recite the book of filial piety from memory. She's obedient. She has only 2 sisters. She sews birds onto silk with great delicacy. Her father is known for steady accounting. Each detail mattered, because marriage was not just about 2 people. It was about merging 2 lineages, 2 sets of ancestors, 2 household economies, and the bride was the pivot point, both offering and offered, on the day of inspection, if it came. The girl might be summoned to bow before the prospective mother-in-law. She might be asked to walk slowly, despite the pain of bound feet. She might be asked to serve fruit, to speak a line of poetry, to keep her eyes lowered and her movements graceful. Her silence, too, would be read like a letter. Was it graceful or sullen? Did she know when to answer, when not to? Sometimes her voice was not heard at all. She might be watched through a curtain, her walk observed through a screen. In high-status families, she might never see the groom until the wedding day. Her body and behavior passed between women like fine porcelain, quietly judged but never spoken to directly. And still the process continued. If approved, the groom's family would send back a formal acceptance, along with gifts, bolts of silk, perhaps a jade ornament, a basket of mooncakes. But these were not tokens of love. They were confirmation that the bride passed inspection. Next came the dowry, a parade of possessions, chests lacquered in red, carried by hired porters, each item publicly inventoried, as much for prestige as for practicality. Bronze mirrors, hairpins, linen, cooking pots, all wrapped in symbolism. But no matter how many items a bride brought, none outweighed the question: could she remain composed when everything depended on her silence? So, as you drift now, letting the hush of history settle over your thoughts, ask yourself, what does it mean when a girl is prepared for a life where her every movement is proof of her worth, but her voice is not invited to speak? The room is dim now, lit by oil lamps flickering against carved wooden screens. Somewhere in the quiet quarters of a household too grand for simplicity and too structured for warmth, a girl kneels beside her mother. Her hair is being brushed. Her back is being straightened, and her mouth, though filled with questions, is kept shut. Tomorrow, the groom's aunt will arrive. Not the groom himself, no. He will remain distant, aloof, represented by women. The aunt's task is to see, to confirm, the final bride check before the wedding contract is locked in. The girl's mother instructs her carefully. Smile only once. Speak only if spoken to. When they ask about your embroidery, refer to your grandmother. Never praise yourself. It is not about truth. It is about tone. In Ming China, even tone was measured. A girl who seemed too clever risked being labeled sharp. A girl who seemed to slow, dull. If she moved too quickly, she lacked grace. Too slowly, she lacked strength. Her tea must be hot. Her bow must be deep. Her eyes must lower without looking away. The aunt would check not just the girl, but the household. The incense used, the lacquer of the dowry trunks, the girl's sleeping quarters, the family's altar. Every detail whispered a story about how the girl had been raised, and how she might raise others. And so, the girl was told to say little. Her best chance at passing was obedience. Sometimes the aunt would ask questions that were traps in disguise. What do you think of your father's ledgers? Do you enjoy poems about loyal wives? Would you consider serving your in-laws directly, should the need arise? Each answer was noted, each pause examined, and behind her, the matchmaker, ever present, would offer soft reassurances or subtle clarifications. She served as both protector and translator, smoothing over any hesitation in tone, any flicker of emotion. But the girl, she had no such luxury, because she was not speaking to be understood. She was speaking to prove she had been trained. What happened after approval varied. In some households, the bride would be gifted new shoes, red silk, with soles stitched by the groom's sisters. In others, she would be sent a phoenix hairpin, a symbol of honor and obedience. Rarely was it romantic. It was confirmation, coded into objects. Yet even once accepted, the bride's test was not over. On the day of the wedding, the scrutiny only deepened. She would be veiled, heavily painted, her hands hidden in long sleeves, carried in a sedan chair, not walking, not allowed to stumble. Arriving at a house she had never seen, greeted by women she had never met. At the threshold, she was expected to step over a lit stove, symbolic but also literal. To stumble would be bad luck, to show fear worse. Inside, she would serve tea to her in-laws, kneel before tablets of ancestral spirits, and bow to a groom who had been watching all along, but had never spoken to her. And then, in the quiet of the night, her final inspection would begin. Not as dramatic as Rome's bedsheet, not as public, but deeply coded in silence. If she wept too loudly, she might be considered weak. If she resisted, even in discomfort, she risked shaming her family. If she showed too much eagerness, her virtue would be questioned. She was meant to remain still, even in pain, even in confusion, especially in fear, because composure was everything. In Ming China, a woman's reputation was a mask that must never slip. Her body could be bound, bruised, bent, but her expression must remain calm. Every glance, every breath, every word that passed her lips was part of her value. Not her desires, not her joy, just her value. And it did not end there. Once married, the bride became daughter-in-law. Her husband's mother became her superior. She would serve at family meals, rise before dawn to sweep the courtyards, wash the robes, heat the water. Her speech would be modest, her laughter restrained, her own name rarely spoken, replaced by titles: daughter, wife, mother of so-and-so. Her identity dissolved into function. Even her letters, when permitted, were censored. Daughters, law wrote to their birth families only with permissions, and often in stylized language, reporting not feelings, but health, seasons, harvests, and deference. And if she failed to conceive a son within the first few years, the scrutiny would return, this time not from strangers, but from within the household. Her in-laws might blame her womb, her husband might take a concubine, her sisters-in-law might whisper, her food might grow colder, her tasks heavier. She would never be told outright, but she would feel it all over again. She would be inspected, this time not as a bride, but as a disappointment. So now, as you lie here in your own quiet room, untouched by rituals of tea and dowry, let yourself imagine her, the girl who smiled only once, who walked on broken toes to pour hot water, 4 elders who never thanked her. And ask yourself this: what kind of world teaches a girl that survival depends not on who she is, but how well she disappears into the expectations of others? Dawn breaks over tiled rooftops glazed with morning mist. In the courtyard of her new home, the young bride stands with her hands folded, waiting for the sound of her mother-in-law's footsteps. She has slept little, not because of the wedding, or even the pain in her feet, but because she's already counting the hours to her next duty. She must prepare rice, then warm water, then sweep the outer path with silence. No one has called her by name since she arrived. They say, daughter, sometimes you, sometimes nothing at all. She has passed the inspection. She has done everything right. Her teeth were even, her feet small, her bow deep, her silence graceful, and yet she feels less like a wife and more like a shadow, performing someone else's outline. This is what many women in Ming China lived, not just a marriage, but a vanishing. Her value began as beauty, then skill, then silence. Now it becomes service. Her personality must shrink to fit the narrow expectations of her new family. Expectations carried by women who were once brides themselves, now passing the same invisible baton. Her mother-in-law doesn't scold her. Not yet, but she watches. Every movement, every fold of cloth, every bite of food left uneaten. A daughter-in-law who eats too much may be called indulgent. One who eats too little, ungrateful. A daughter-in-law who smiles too often is frivolous. One who smiles too little is cold. The margin for error is purse smaller than the shoes she was bound into as a child. And what of the husband? He, too, was inspected, but differently. his family's name, his education, his prospects, not his feet, not his voice, not his ability to bend. In most households, the groom was not expected to serve. He was waited on, honored, measured not by silence, but by speech. The young bride is told to bring him tea in the morning, to bow before him when he enters. In some homes, she is forbidden to sit at the same table as her in-laws during meals until she bears a child, preferably a son. And so she waits. She waits for permission, for purpose, for approval wrapped in gestures. Instead of words, it's easy to look back and think that was the past. That was tradition. But traditions are not harmless when they train a girl to erase herself for the comfort of others. Even when she does everything right, her security remains fragile. What if she fails to become pregnant? What if she speaks out of turn in front, of a visiting elder? What if her husband takes a concubine and favors the other woman more? There are no formal protections, only the hope that her obedience will buy her peace. And yet, sometimes it does. Some daughters-in-law eventually become the matriarchs. They outlive their mother-in-laws. They raise sons who honor them. They gain power, not by voice, but by duration, by surviving long enough to enforce the very rules that once shackled them, and the cycle continues. The inspections never truly end. They only change hands. The young girl who once bit her tongue now teaches her own daughter to do the same. Don't laugh too loud. Don't cry too much. Don't speak unless spoken to. You only get one chance to make a good B impression. As a wife, you represent the whole family. Her own mother once said these words, and now she says them too. The tragedy is not in the obedience. It's in the forgetting. The forgetting that there was ever an alternative to being shaped like porcelain. And yet, through the cracks, sometimes we catch the light of rebellion. A daughter who refuses to bind her own daughter's feet. A woman who writes her thoughts in hidden poems sewn into the lining of her sleeves. A widow who takes control of her household and quietly refuses to marry off her youngest daughter before 16. These are small, quiet acts. They don't stop the inspection, but they remind us that behind every ritual there is a girl with her own mind, waiting for someone to ask her who she is, instead of how well she performs. So tonight, as you close your eyes and feel the stillness settle around you like a silk robe drawn gently across your shoulders, remember her, the girl who stood, then knelt, then served, all while never truly being seen. And ask yourself this: how many women were measured so precisely, so exhaustively, that they forgot they were ever more than what others hoped they would become? There's a knock at the wooden door, not loud, just a gentle tap, as though to signal that something important and irreversible is about to begin. Inside, an Indian household prepares for a visitor, not a suitor, not a priest, but the factual, a broker of sorts, a matchmaker, but also an accountant. His hands are stained with ink, and tucked under his arm is a thick register, a dowry ledger, bound in soft leather, smudged with years of oil and smoke. It carries the names of daughters yet to be married, and the lists of what must follow them when they leave. This is not the story of one girl. It is the story of thousands. Girls whose futures were measured not by whom they might love, or even whom they might serve, but by what they could bring. In 16th century India, during the rise of the Mughal Empire, and through much of the subcontinent's fragmented kingdoms, the dowry system evolved into a deeply embedded economic structure, one that crossed caste lines, one that adapted to religion, region, and language. But its function remained chillingly consistent. A girl must pay to be accepted, not directly, not with coins in her hand, but with goods, textiles, ornaments, land deeds, cattle, sometimes a painted elephant. The ledger the vakil carries is not private. It contains entries from dozens of families, girls listed not by personality, but by birth year, father's name, caste, and estimated dowry potential. Some entries note complexion, fair, wheatish, dusky. Others mention skill, knows Ramayana by memory, sings in temple weaves. But these details are just frosting. The real matter lies in columns, gold in Tola's land, pshare, silk bolts, servants. When the vakil is seated, the negotiation begins. Tea is poured, polite smiles exchanged. The girl herself is not present. She might be peeking from behind a curtain, listening to numbers spoken about, purr as though she were elsewhere. And, in a way, she is. She has already begun to disappear into the currency of her own wedding. Her father opens a drawer. Out comes a list, handwritten, revised over weeks. It is more precise than anything else in the house. 5 gold bangles, 3 saris, 1 from Kanchipuram, to silver lamps, a teakwood box, a cow, healthy. Already carved 1 gold nose ring, a bed carved with peacock feathers. The vakil nods, respectable, but not enough. He turns the ledger to another page. You see, Chatterjee's daughter brought 100 tolas of silver. Her father's land was smaller than yours. The implication is clear. The ledger is not just a record. It is a ranking system. A quiet competition where no one ever wins, but everyone must play. The father sighs. The mother presses her lips together. They cannot say what they want to say. She is kind. She is intelligent. She writes poetry. She tends to her blind grandmother. Without being asked, these things cannot be recorded in tolas or sandalwood weight. In many parts of India, the dowry was seen not only as tradition, but duty. A girl was not just leaving, she was transferring. And a transfer must be accompanied by goods, furniture, bedding, utensils, all to set up her new home. But increasingly, it was less about utility and more about prestige. The more a girl brought, the more her husband's family would value her. Not love her, not protect her, tolerate her. And if she brought little, the consequences could begin slowly. First, isolation, then blame, then perhaps cruelty. In some cases, something far worse. The girl might never hear the words, but she would see it in how the in-laws looked at her. spoke around her. Every day she stayed, she had to justify her cost. Sometimes the father returned to the factual. We will add a silver mirror and a parcel of grain. He writes it down. The girl's price goes up, but her voice does not, because she was never asked. Do you want to marry him? Do you care that he has never looked you in the eye? Do you know what he thinks of you? The questions don't fit in ledgers, and so they go unscared. Dowry existed in many cultures, but here it became ritualized, painted into wedding invitations, chanted into blessing, hidden in the folds of red bridal saris, tied tightly round a girl's waist, not for beauty, but to carry the weight of her worth as you rest now, as the silence of your room grows heavier, and the air settles around your shoulders like soft cloth. Think of her, a girl not yet 16, her wrists clinking with bangles, her gaze fixed on the floor as her future is calculated in ounces and ornaments. And ask yourself, what happens when love is replaced by inventory, and a girl becomes her own dowry? Asterisk, the ledger has been closed for now, tied shut with a string dyed in turmeric. The vakil has left, and in the silence that follows his departure, the household feels heavier, not just because of the negotiations, but because of what those negotiations imply. The daughter sits quietly in her room, tracing patterns into the clay floor with her toe. She knows not to ask what was said. She knows not to speak unless spoken to. But she has been trained over years, not days, to read tone. The way her father tightens the cloth around his waist. The way her mother straightens a vase that needs no straightening. Something did not go as hoped. The dowry was not enough. It rarely is dot in Ming China. The inspection was of the body. In Sparta, of movement. In Babylon, of beauty. But here, in the many regions of medieval and early modern India, the inspection was financial and relentless. Even after the marriage had been arranged, dowry was not a one-time payment. It was a living debt. A girl's father might promise part of the dowry now, and the rest over time. But if the final payment didn't come, or came late, the girl suffered. The wedding might go forward, but the warmth of the groom's family would curdle. The whispering would begin. She brought less than promised. Her father lied. She owes us more. And though the girl herself had no part in the promises or the debts, she would pay in 1,000 quiet ways. Sometimes in how she was fed, less than others. Sometimes in where she was made to sleep, not in the wedding bed, but on a mat near the fire. Sometimes in more overt punishments, bruises covered with gold powder to hide the shame on certain regions, especially among land-holding families. There was an unspoken rule. The richer the dowry, the more gently the girl would be treated. She was seen as an investment, a financial advantage, a way to expand property or ease debt, and like all investments, her treatment reflected her return. Some girls were returned to their parents if the promised items didn't arrive. A shameful event, not for the groom's family, but for the bride's. She would live out her years unmarried, a burden on her brother's wives. remembered mostly for what she didn't bring. Others stayed in those homes, but lived invisible lives. No affection, no protection. A kind of quiet exile lived out in the middle of a crowded house. And for a few, the consequences were worse. By the 18th century, and continuing even into colonial times, dowry violence took root in some regions. A girl's inability to meet her price might lead not only to humiliation, but to harm. In-laws might set conditions. Send gold before the monsoon. Send a mule before Diwali. Send furniture before the child is born. If those conditions weren't met, the threats grew louder, sometimes shouted, sometimes written in letters stained with tears. But these dangers didn't start in violence. They started in expectation, the idea that a girl must prove her worth, not through her joy, her humor, or her kindness, but through what others could extract from her. Even love, if it bloomed, was shaped by dowry. A groom who might otherwise feel affection was reminded daily of what her family had or hadn't paid. His own mother might say, "She is lovely, yes, but she came empty-handed." His sisters might laugh behind closed doors. Even he, though fond of her, might repeat the ledger aloud when frustrated. "I could have married better, for more." And still the girl served. She lit the lamps. She scrubbed the brass. She bore children. She smiled. Her only hope, perhaps, was to produce a son quickly. A son might protect her. A son might earn her favor. A son might shift the balance of power, even just a little. Because once she became the mother of a boy, she was no longer just she was a vessel of legacy. And yet, even then, the ledger haunted her. Her own daughter would one day face the same inspection, the same quiet listing of assets, the same whispered doubt if the number didn't seem high enough. And now, as a mother, she would be the one who wrote the list, and in doing so, she would teach her daughter what she had been taught. To be chosen, you must pay. To be accepted, you must offer. To be loved, you must earn it. Play in silver, sandalwood, and silence. And now, as the world around you quiets, the light dimming, your breath slowing, picture her once more, sitting beside her husband's mother, stitching a piece of red muslin, her fingers raw, her face unreadable. She is not angry. She is not broken. She is simply continuing. Because continuation is how most women survive systems like these. And as the rhythm of rest begins to carry you gently toward sleep, ask yourself, when a girl's future is priced before she ever speaks for herself, how can she ever believe she is more than what she's worth to others? Evening sets in across the village, smoke curling upward from clay hearths, jackals crying in the distance, the scent of sandalwood oil rising softly from altars lit for Lakshmi, goddess of wealth. Inside the house, the new bride carries a brass bowl of lentils to the veranda, her feet bare. Her eyes lowered not out of shame, but habit. It has been weeks since the wedding. The trunks she arrived with, lacquered and locked, still sit beneath her new bed. Her gold bangles, the ones counted so carefully by her father's accountant, have already begun to lose their polish, and the whispers, they haven't stopped. If anything, they've deepened. Her husband is kind enough when he speaks, but his mother is colder now. The grain promised as part of the third installment of the dowry has not yet arrived. Bend, and in this house debts become women's burdens, even when they did not make the promise. You must remind your father, the mother-in-law says, with syrup in her tone and steel beneath it. It isn't good for a family to forget its word. The girl nods. She says nothing, but inside she mourns a silence that was handed to her, not chosen. She did not write the dowry list. She did not negotiate its weight. But now she must carry it on her back, folded in with the rest of her identity. And it is not just the mother-in-law. Even the household help knows she's a 1.5 daughter, they say behind her back, which means she brought half of what was promised, and the rest is uncertain. Her worth, spoken not in insults, but in fractions. It's easy from the outside to imagine resistance. Why not refuse? Why not flee? Why not speak? But the chains of dowry are not forged overnight. They are braided into lullabies, taught in kitchen corners, whispered between generations, reinforced by mothers who say, "This is how it is," not out of cruelty, but fatigue. And if the girl did resist, she might shame her father, who spent his life saving every coin. She might break her mother's spirit, who spent years gathering every item. She might ruin her sister's chance to marry. She might be blamed for her own mistreatment, because in a system built on exchange, the woman who refuses the terms becomes the problem, not the terms themselves. And yet, some resisted anyway. History leaves us traces of these quiet rebellions. A bride who insisted on no dowry and chose a husband from a poorer caste. A mother who divided her property equally between daughters and sons, in defiance of custom. A family who adopted an orphan girl and raised her without calculation, unheard of in many circles. But these are footnotes, not headlines, exceptions, not patterns. The pattern, the cruel, enduring pattern, is that for centuries, Indian girls were not only married with dowries, they were the dowries. Their bodies, their labor, their silence, all part of the transaction. Even today, the echo remains. Not always in gold, sometimes in expectations. She's educated, but can she cook? She works, but will she give up her job for his family? She speaks her mind, but does she know her place? The ledger has changed format, but it has not disappeared. And for the girl sitting in the twilight, fingering the edge, Bill, watching the moon rise behind the lime tree. The cost is not in coin. It is in breath, in knowing she must be agreeable, useful, modest, and never tired, never angry, never too loud, never too much, because the dowry has already been paid, and yet she will spend the rest of her life paying it again. So now, as you settle deeper into rest, as the shadows around you soften into the hush of sleep, think of her, not just one girl, but millions, across generations, walking barefoot into marriages weighed down by expectation, carrying chests of bronze and cloth, but never the right to define her own worth. And ask yourself, what would our history look like If a girl's value was never written in ledgers, but written by her own hand. Baghdad, in the 9th century, was a place of brilliance, not just for its gleaming domes or the golden hue of the Tigris at dawn, but for its mind. The Abbasid Caliphate had turned the city into a beacon of learning, translation, and law. Philosophers debated under porticos. Scholars copied Greek texts into Arabic by lamplight. And somewhere in the shade of a modest courtyard, a young woman was being prepared, not for education, not for debates, but for inspection of a different kind. She would not be examined physically, like the brides of Rome or Babylon. No, in the Islamic traditions of the Abbasid court and its provinces, a woman's marriage worth was negotiated in writing, parchment and ink, law and reputation. But that did not make it any less binding or any more just. The marriage contract, Nekah, was a formal legal document, belayed out terms, the identities of bride and groom, their lineage, and, crucially, the mahr, a mandatory bridal gift paid by the groom to the bride, not her father, not her family, her. On paper, this was revolutionary for its time. It offered a woman's financial recognition. In many cases, the bride could keep the mahr as personal property, even after marriage. If the marriage dissolved, she retained it. In theory, this provided protection. But as always, theory and practice diverged, because even before the ink dried, a woman's body and her behavior were already being appraised, not in marketplaces, not in whispers, but in the way witnesses spoke her name, the way neighbors described her family, the way her silence was mistaken for virtue. To be a virtuous bride in Abbasid Baghdad was not just to be religious. It was to be quiet, unseen, untouched, a woman's virginity, while not a legal prerequisite for marriage, carried immense social weight. Gossip could undermine a match. A rumor could cost her more than reputation. It could cost her the value of her mahr, the willingness of suitors, the stability of her family's standing. And so, many girls were trained from childhood. Keep your voice low. Do not walk alone. Speak only through your wali, your male guardian. She had the right to consent. Yes, but that right was often ceremonial. The father or uncle would speak for her, and in many households, the consent itself was gathered in solitude, a question asked behind a curtain. Do you accept? And the girl would whisper yes or stay silent, which was often treated as assent. No one asked if she felt seen. No one asked what she knew of the man whose name had been inked beside hers. And while Islamic law gave women rights to keep their property, to refuse marriage, to initiate divorce under specific terms, those rights required access to scholars, to clerics, to literacy. Most women had none. So instead, they relied on rituals, on the veil, not just for modesty, but for protection from speculation. On henna nights, where elder women coached brides on how to behave. On whispered prayers, not for love, but for endurance. And through it all, the contract remained central. written by men, witnessed by men, and often negotiated without the bride even in the room. Her age might be listed, her dowry amount, her guardian's name, but not her story, not her hopes, not her fears. And once married, her life narrowed further. If her husband treated her well, she might find peace. If not, she could return to her ma in theory. But to do so was to risk shame. To break the contract was to step outside respectability. There were women who tried. Some appealed to judges, caddies, to escape neglect, abuse, or abandonment. Some won. Others were sent home, told to be patient. Because in a society that prized legal precision, a woman's pain was harder to prove than a man's signature. So even as Baghdad lit the ancient world with brilliance, the girls behind its high garden walls were still being shaped, not by philosophy or language, but by the fine lines of contracts they never authored. As you drift into rest, eyes heavy with thought, picture her, a bride in red silk, kneeling beside her mother, while the men negotiate beyond the lattice screen. She does not cry. She does not interrupt. She simply waits for her name to be spoken, her future decided, and the ink to dry. And ask yourself, what power does a contract hold if the one it binds most deeply was never allowed to write a word of it? Asterisk, the courtyard is hushed. The ink has dried. The Qadi has departed. The contract rolled and tied with a length of gold-threaded string. Two male witnesses, their duty complete, return to their tea and muttered assessments of the dowry sum. Generous, one says, though neither. Pass met the bride, and the bride, she is behind the lattice wall, her face still covered by her veil, her hands scented with rosewater. She has not been asked to speak again. Her consent was recorded in silence, a nod, perhaps, or a quiet eye except through the screen. It was enough in Abbasid Baghdad. Women's legal personhood was surprisingly progressive for the era. In theory, they could inherit, trade, testify, and even initiate legal proceedings. But access and custom often stood in the way. Laws existed, but so did norms, and between the two lay a narrow bridge that many women could never cross. Asterisk. She knows this, even if no one has ever spoken it aloud. And so, when the ma is counted to 50 dinars, a ring, and a bolt of Damascus silk, she nods politely. The ma is hers, legally. She could, if she wished, use it to leave, buy her own poem, keep it hidden, but in reality it will likely be given to her new household. Symbolic property, a right that's right only until challenged. Some women in the Abbasid world did exercise that right. They appear in court records, listed by name. Fatima bint Musa, who sued for her delayed dowry. Layla of Kufa, who refused a second marriage until her first ma was honored. Nadira of Basra, who filed for Kula divorce initiated by a woman citing cruelty. But these women were rare. Their boldness remembered precisely because it was exceptional. Most brides, like the girl behind the lattice, would never set foot in a courtroom. Their reputations were their armor, and reputation, once stained, was hard to restore. So, instead, she learns to survive within the contract. In the days following her wedding, she is trained anew, not by law, but by expectation. Her mother-in-law teaches her how to prepare lentils the way her son likes them. Her husband reminds her to lower her gaze when speaking. Her neighbors observe her prayer attendance, her dress, the timbre of her voice, a bride who laughs too loudly, gossips too freely, answers too sharply. She is whispered about, even if she obeys the contract to the letter, because for all the formal rights afforded by Islamic law, virtue was policed in courtyards and kitchens, not just courts. A virtuous wife was chaste, yes, but also invisible, respectable, but restrained, present, but never dominant. Even the idea of veiling, though diverse across the Muslim world, was heavily shaped in Abbasid Baghdad. It evolved from modesty into a symbol of class, piety, and control. The wealthier the family, the more thoroughly the women were veiled, sometimes even within their own homes, before servants and guests, not for religious law alone, but to preserve the family's honor. And if a bride resisted, some did, quietly. A girl might read when others weren't watching, write letters of poetry to other women, keep a secret coin pouch hidden behind the water jars, say no in the smallest of ways, by waiting just a moment too long to rise, by choosing not to respond to gossip, by teaching her daughters how to read. These were not revolutions. They were insistences, tiny acts that refused to let a contract become a cage. And yet, for every girl who managed a whisper of resistance, hundreds more disappeared beneath the weight of duty, folded into households, into expectations, into a kind of soft erasure that no court could punish because it had never been made illegal. So she endures, she cooks, she bows, she memorizes the hadith on obedience. She recites the dua for patience. She kisses the hand of a husband who never once asked what she dreamed about as a child. And through it all, the contract remains, stored in a wooden chest. Read only if something goes wrong. Otherwise, it sits quietly, much like the girl it governs. As you lie here now, eyes fluttering between wakefulness and sleep, imagine her sitting on a low cushion, stringing pomegranate seeds onto a skewer for the household's guests. She hums an old poem her grandmother taught her. No one hears it, but she sings it anyway. And ask yourself, if a woman is protected only on paper, but never in practice, is she truly protected at all? Asterisk, the year moves on. The bride, once a name on parchment, a silhouette behind a lattice, is now a wife, a daughter-in-law, a manager of household order. Her daily routine begins before dawn, not with prayer, though that follows, but with preparation of water, of bread, of herself. She ties her veil tightly, not out of devotion alone, but out of vigilance. In her neighborhood of tiled roofs and narrow alleys, even a glimpse of hair becomes cause for comment. Even a delay in greeting the neighbor's wife might be interpreted as pride. Her marriage contract remains locked in a scroll box, still scented faintly with the rose oil dabbed on it the day it was signed. Perma, that symbolic guarantee, was never touched. It was handed discreetly to her husband's father, as expected. Not required, but expected. This is the quiet balance that defines her life now. What is promised and what is practiced. The Abbasid era was, in many ways, ahead of its time. There are surviving legal commentaries that uphold a woman's right to reject a marriage, to demand delayed mahr, to seek separation on grounds of harm. But these rights depended entirely on circumstance. Was she literate? Was her wali supportive? Would a qadi take her seriously? Even among scholars, the idea of obedient disobedience emerged. Discussions on how far a wife could resist her husband's commands without being considered sinful. The answer invariably fell in favor of obedience. A wife could advise, perhaps, but not define. She could withdraw intimacy only if he failed to provide support. But even then, proving such failure was near impossible. So many learned women chose another path, quiet wisdom. They became educators in the mosque courtyards. They taught hadith to other women in hushed voices. They wrote letters in Persian, in Arabic, in Turkish, coded with metaphors too subtle for reproach. But most simply lived. They embroidered names of beloved poets into the hems of their garments. They whispered verses over the cooking pot. They taught their daughters what not to say, and what always to pretend. And yet, in the legal scrolls of the time, they were present. Fatima, daughter of Ismail, requested an increased mahr. Buy and received it. Zainab of Nishaper challenged a custody ruling. A woman from Wasit, her name lost, petitioned a qadi for divorce on grounds of cruelty and was granted her freedom, along with her mahr. So not every woman disappeared, but these stories, tucked in legal texts and rarely told aloud, do not erase the hundreds of others, the women who stayed quiet, because quietness was safer, who fulfilled their roles not with joy, but with duty, not because they believed the contract protected them, but because it was all they were offered, a piece of paper, a legal shield that no one would raise should it ever need to be used. In the evenings, she now sits by the window, stringing prayer beads slowly. Her husband's voice rises from the courtyard, debating something with a neighbor. The servants shuffle dishes. The children of the house, not hers, not yet, run barefoot through the tiled hallways. She listens, but she does not speak. There is a comfort in the silence now, not peace, exactly, but stillness, a rhythm. She is praised for her modesty, respected for her obedience, whispered about for being so quiet, so proper, so correct. But no one ever asks her, what did you hope for? Did you want to teach, to write, to walk alone by the river? No one asks, because the contract was signed, and in their eyes that was the end of her beginning. So tonight, as your breath settles into the soft rhythm of rest, imagine her, older now, wiser, sitting beside her daughter, brushing her hair, preparing her for what's to come. She recites the same dua she was once taught for patience, for protection, for clarity. But maybe this time she adds a line of her own, a quiet blessing. For a world where a girl's signature is not required to be hidden behind a curtain. And ask yourself, what would it mean, truly mean, if every woman's name appeared beside her husband's on equal lines, in equal ink,